So good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute honor and privilege to be here with all of you today. I'm always happy and excited to be here in places with people who, are really excited about making a difference and change makers, because it is the theme of our afternoon. So today I really want to focus on reconciliation. We hear a lot of talk about what that is. So I want to talk about what that means to us at the Caring Society and go through some of our work and some of our challenges, I guess, that we've gone through as an organization. Some people think we're an absolutely huge organization, but we are actually now we're 8, but for a long time we were only 3 or 4 people. So just to kind of chat about, what that means as a small organization trying to make change for First Nations kids across the country. So this gentleman here, this is Duncan Campbell Scott. Many people actually know him as a Confederate poet, someone who did some really great things. He won a medal. He was recognized and given honorary doctorates, but a lot of us also know him as the superintendent of then known Indian Affairs. Does anybody know who this is? Does anyone recognize this face? Go ahead. Exactly. So this is Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce. So I'll just talk about a little bit about what you said, because that's exactly what he was trying to do. So he was a contemporary of Duncan Campbell Scott. So he was the president of the American Public Health Association, and he was one of the founding members of the Canadian Public Health Association. So he was recruited to look at the Department of Indian Affairs program for Indigenous kids, look at the residential schools, and write a report about it. What he ended up finding was residential schools, as a lot of us know now, were hotbeds for tuberculosis. So what he said was, suffice it to say that of the 1,537 pupils reported upon, 25% are dead of one school. With an absolutely accurate statement, 69% of ex-pupils are dead. Which is shocking, and what he documented most shockingly in his reports was that a lot of those deaths were preventable in the residential schools. So because Duncan Campbell Scott actually said to him, well, these reforms that you're recommending are too expensive to implement, which is something that we keep hearing, and it's not something, it's a narrative that we've heard throughout the years. It's too expensive. And, Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, we see him as an unsung hero because we know that he was a champion for children. And we know that there were many deaths in residential schools. So this is a figure from CBC that looks at the number of deaths in residential schools. So it was 1 in 25. And then if you look at what it was for World War II, it's 1 in 26. Both very tragic. And we're talking about vulnerable children. It was estimated that about 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children went to residential schools. But I always like to think of it in terms of there were other places that children went. So we look at, Indian day schools. There were other institutions that aren't maybe as well documented as residential schools. So this number is likely low. So a lot of people kind of have this mentality that, well, this is just what they did in the day. This is how they did business back in those days of 1895 when Duncan Campbell Scott signed the first warrant for First Nations kids to be removed from their homes. People didn't know better. But as we know from the story of Peter Henderson Bryce, they did know better. People did know better. There were people speaking up at that time and speaking out against these inequities for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children. And for us at the Caring Society, one of the key barriers to reconciliation is not doing better when you know better. This is a really frightening figure. So we look at a lot of us who are working in those areas of social services, child welfare, all of those kinds of areas know that the removals of Indigenous kids from their homes have continued. We look at the 60 scoop throughout history, where mass amounts of children were removed from their homes, relocated to sometimes different areas in the country, sometimes out of country. We've heard of stories of children going to the United States, all other places. And then, of course, you might have heard of this term, the Millennial Scoop, where First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children are removed from their homes for child welfare purposes. And this continues today. This figure looks at the number of nights that First Nations children specifically spent away from their families from 1989 to 2017. I don't believe it includes Saskatchewan. That is a long time for First Nations kids to be away from their families. We think of it in terms of children not having their teddy bears, children not being in their beds, not being in their communities, not having the opportunity to know their culture, know their language. So we don't think of it in terms of years. We don't think of it in terms of, money. We think of it in terms of how many nights are children away from their families, away from their communities. And as many people know, and I'm sure some people have seen in this room, that a lot of times in communities, First Nations communities specifically, there's just not the resources available to support families in the way that they need to be supported. So we look at this issue of neglect. And now I know there's different definitions of neglect, and neglect is approached from a Western point of view. But essentially what neglect looks like in the context of our work is that children are removed because of reasons of neglect. And this could be things like poverty, poor housing, caregiver substance misuse. So what that means is families are not supported in their communities to, for example, if they don't have food in their pantry, to go to a food bank, because that is often not there in First Nations communities. They don't have the option to go to treatment centers because those just aren't, there's not enough funding to put them into communities. And it varies across the country. So when we look at those key drivers to neglect, we look at how that it has influenced child welfare and how there is an overrepresentation of First Nations kids in child welfare. And the same can be said about Inuit and Métis children as well. I believe it was a Statistics Canada, their most recent stat is over half of the kids who are in care are Indigenous, which is really scary when you think about our population. So we think, we live in Canada, we live in this beautiful nation. People move here because things are better here. But then we think of something like the Kids' Rights Index. So there are 144 countries that participate in the Kids' Rights Index. And they look at things like education, housing, and they rate countries based on where they fall in terms of those things. So we're currently 52nd in the world overall. In terms of kids' rights specifically, we're in the bottom tier. We fall in the last categories, somewhere between 138 and 144, which is really poor when you think about the fact that we are a developed nation and people move here because they think Canada brings them so many opportunities, which it does, but I don't think for all kids. And we know this to be true. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final reports outlining years and years of systemic discrimination in their reports, calling on all people in the country to take action and to make a difference. Child welfare was number 1 in their reports. And Jordan's principle, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, was the third call to action. These issues are important for a reason, and there's a reason they're number 1 and number 3. So it's not for a lack of trying among the years. So the Caring Society, some of you may have heard that we filed a human rights complaint in 2007. But it wasn't because we didn't try to work with the federal government on these issues of child welfare. Agencies started, First Nations Child and Family Service agencies started to open in the 80s to respond to child welfare in a culturally appropriate way, to make sure that kids are getting services in ways that meet their distinct cultures and languages. Now, the agencies were funded under what was first called the, well, apparently it was just some, I guess, ad hoc arrangements when it first started. So then, because the services are provided by the federal government, they created this, what's called the Directive 20-1. So one of the things, so among the years, they said this Directive 20-1, it's not working. It didn't include things like prevention. So it was really just about keeping kids in care. The Joint National Policy Review was a report that came out in the year 2000 and looked at how that directive was discriminatory and how it really needed funding formulas would have to include prevention to make sure that we provide those services before, providing those things like I talked about, programs for families where they can access treatment centers, just all those kinds of things that encourage prevention of these issues. The Caring Society worked in 2004 and 2005 on what's called the Wande reports. We recruited experts in economics and law and all these different areas to write these reports called the Wande reports, which would become really historical in the Canadian human rights complaint. They kind of set the foundation for the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal complaint that we filed. These reports said, this underfunding of child welfare, it continues. Jordan's principle, a child first principle, isn't being implemented. So that's something that needs to happen. Those reports came out in 2005. The federal government, or the Department of Indigenous Services, which is now known, approved all of the recommendations. They said, yes, this stuff needs to happen. 2007 comes around. That's 2 years since the reports come out. The Caring Society worked with the Assembly of First Nations because they said, no, we don't want to engage in further reports. We want to take action because we see this as an issue of childhood. Children don't get another childhood. We can't just put their childhoods on pause. We need to take action immediately. So what happened is we filed a complaint to the Canadian Human Rights Commission in 2007, alleging that the government discriminates against First Nations kids by providing less child welfare funding than they do to others in the province, and that they don't implement Jordan's principle to make sure that all First Nations kids get the services they need when they need them. Now, we were overjoyed in 2016. So what happens is so we won the case. For those of you, spoiler alert, no, I'm just kidding. So we won the case in 2016. So the way it works is you submit a complaint to the Canadian Human Rights Commission, who then can, if they see, so you file it under the Charter of Human Rights, and if the tribunal says, well, yes, I think there could be discrimination here, then they refer it to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And that's what they did, because they said, okay, this could be a thing. This, we think there could be discrimination here. Let's see it. So after many long years of the government fighting back over this, we finally heard evidence starting in 2014, the full hearing on the merits of the case. So we had experts from across the country in child welfare working in agencies, directors who've worked in agencies for years. Experts like Amy Bombay, she's a researcher out of Dalhousie, Nico Chokme, he's I don't know the word, econometrician, Dr. John Loxley. There's all these experts that have testifying who worked on those Wanda reports saying, yes, this is inequitable. First Nations agencies are getting less than what other people are getting in the country. And a lot of First Nations communities have a lot of higher needs because of our history with residential schools, the 60s Scoop, trauma in communities that just need support and don't have it. So it was an amazing day in 2016. I remember sitting there at lunch and the ruling came in, and I don't know if a lot of you probably know my director, Cindy Blackstock, our fearless leader. She was scrolling on her phone and she just had a big smile on her face that we won this case. And it was an amazing day. But we knew at that moment that there was still so much more work to be done. So in the ruling, the tribunal made 4 initial rulings: to cease discriminatory practices in First Nations child welfare, reform the First Nations child welfare program, so that directive that I talked about, and then there was another funding formula called the Enhanced Prevention Focused Approach, which added prevention, but was still found to be inequitable. So to reform the program, stop applying the narrow definition of Jordan's principle, and to take measures to immediately implement the scope of Jordan's principle. So for those of you who don't know this lovely gentleman on the screen, this is Jordan River Anderson. He was a young boy from Norway House Cree Nation. He was born in the hospital in Winnipeg, Manitoba in 1999. So he was born with complex medical needs. So his parents had to go to Winnipeg because there are no hospitals and no medical care in his community, which is remote in northern Manitoba. After 2 years, the doctor said, well, Jordan can go and live in a family home with supports that he needs. Now, because his parents had to make the really tough decision to put Jordan into the care of child welfare so that he could actually access supports, and they could access supports for him, because there would be nothing in his community to support him. So because of the fact that he was under provincial care, but he lived in a First Nations community, the federal and provincial governments fought over who would pay for that at-home care. Jordan sadly sat in hospital, seeing other little ones go home, and he never ever had a chance to go and live in a family home. He sadly passed away in 2005. We think of Jordan in all of our work that we do because his spirit guides us in our work. His father, in 2007, stood in the House of Commons to help pass Jordan's principle, a child-first principle that says First Nations kids get the services when they need them. That's it. It doesn't just limit it to healthcare, it's also covering things like education, recreational, all of those things that are publicly funded and available to all of their kids in the country. Jordan's principle was a key component of our CHRT ruling. And, since that time, we've had 7 non-compliance orders. So if the government didn't, act upon the rulings that the tribunal gave, we could fight them, basically, through the tribunal to make sure that they do implement the services. And so through this process, a lot of things have come about that the government has to do. So Jordan's principle is very large in spirit, and it really captures the essence of what Jordan's principle was meant to be and should be. The government has continually tried to narrow the scope of Jordan's principle. For a while, we heard that it was only First Nations kids with multiple needs, requiring multiple service providers. There were several definitions. There was a report that came out through the Assembly of First Nations, and they released this chart. They had done a lot of work with some other organizations, and apparently Jordan would not have even qualified for Jordan's principle under the government's chart that they had created, which is ridiculous. So now it applies to all publicly funded services. Because Canada was non-compliant, it was linked to the tragic death of 2 young girls in Ontario in Wapakika First Nation. They knew that this community needed mental health supports, But they didn't fund it. They said, well, this is just, you need to complete this information. And it's really that bureaucratic red tape that led to the death of those two young girls. Had they had the supports they needed, they might be with us today. Jordan's principle in the tribunal's ruling says that it applies to First Nations kids on and off reserve. The federal government currently will fund First Nations kids ordinarily resident on reserve, or if there is a non-status child, they can have a letter of support from the community. It currently does not apply to Métis children. The Inuit have created what's called a Child First Initiative, so they are covered under that, but I don't think it's to the full scope of Jordan's principle. And so this is something that we're going to be looking at later on in March with the tribunal, because we really want to be clear about who is funded through Jordan's principle and who can access the supports. Again, it applies to all public services. We talk about this notion of substantive equality. So it's not enough to say, we're going to fund a support for a child. We need to make sure that it takes into consideration that First Nations kids weren't equal to begin with. They don't have often the supports in their communities that others have. So really the substantive equality notion is about looking at, not just the life of the child and what's available, but also what's available or not available in their community. We weren't sure for a while if the government was taking into consideration the best interests of the child. We know this is paramount. Children need to have their interests looked at, and not just in a way that looks at one aspect of their life. It takes into consideration all of the aspects of what it is to be a child, their spiritual needs, their emotional needs, everything that it takes to be. For a long time, the federal government relied on what's called case conferencing. So not looking at, letters of recommendation from professionals who are, qualified in these areas, but saying, I think we need to do some case conferencing about these issues. And really that just delays a service. The prime concern for us at the Caring Society with Jordan's Principle is we want to make sure kids are getting the services they need, not in a month, not in 2 months, when they need them. And a lot of people, some maybe in this room, think that Jordan's Principle ends on March 31st, 2019, which is not that long away. That's false. It's not something that ends. Jordan's Principle is now a legal rule. So anybody can submit a Jordan's Principle request. There is a call center that's open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, where people can call to make a request. Families can submit, or guardians can submit on behalf of a First Nations child. Organizations working with First Nations children can also submit requests if several children have the same need. We've seen school boards apply, we've seen friendship centers apply. It's really not just limited to, and it's not just limited to health. There's a timeline that the government has to abide by. So if it's an individual request, the government has 48 hours to give a response back to that family or guardian who submit for an individual request, or 12 hours if it's urgent and life-threatening and could do irreparable harm to the child. For group requests, it's 1 week and 48 hours in urgent situations. The number is actually 214,000. According to the government's website, over 214,000 services have been approved, and we know that a lot of kids have been helped through Jordan's Principle, but we know, working firsthand with it, that there still is a lot of work that needs to be done in Jordan's Principle. So as I had said, actually since I submitted this presentation, there's been another non-compliance ruling. So it says 6, but it's actually 7 non-compliance orders. Some of the ones we talked about, talks about Jordan's principle. There was one on February 1st, 2018, which looked at how do we make sure the agencies, the First Nations Child and Family Service agencies, are getting what they need. So they were ordered to fund on actuals, not based on a funding formula. So fund the needs of those agencies. And one of the things that they were ordered to do was to actually look at what the underfunding is to the First Nations Child and Family Service agencies. And there was a study done by the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy through the University of Ottawa, which kind of looked at what the Wande reports did, but an updated version. And basically what they said is, it's still similar. There's still underfunding happening, and agencies have a lot of needs, and they need capacity. One of the things that agencies are allowed to do is they're allowed to submit retroactive costs, so to make them whole. Because a lot of the agencies, the staff members, were not getting what other staff members would be funded by the province. And this just became normal. And same thing with Jordan's principle. Retroactive can be submitted as well, back to 2007 when Jordan's principle was passed in the House of Commons. So we're kind of in a moment of transition, I guess you could say, because we don't really know what's going to happen past March 31st. We're not sure if the tribunal will retain jurisdiction over the case, which means that they would oversee it for, we're hoping, another year as we change governments, because we know that when governments change, a lot of things can change as well. And a lot of good work can be reversed, so we don't want that to happen. So we're pushing for another year with the tribunal. It's a panel of two lawyers who really don't have to do it, but we know that they're committed to children and First Nations children. So before that time, or at least until we know when jurisdiction will be held, our goal is to figure out medium and long-term reform. So how can we make sure there are things in place to make sure Jordan's principle continues, the agencies are still being funded to where their needs are. The other piece that we're pushing for is compensation for the discrimination that First Nations kids had from the time that we filed the complaint to the time we won the case. So under the Canadian Human Rights Commission and under the tribunal, they said that there can be $20,000 in damages awarded, up to $40,000 if the damages were willful and reckless. So we're really hoping that the tribunal will order this to happen so that there can be a trust fund created for First Nations kids who were affected and who are now young adults or even older adults, because that's a long time that has passed in the life of a child. And this Jordan's principle is something that is so, so important, because when we talk about services, we're not just talking about healthcare. We're also talking about something really fundamental, and that's education. We know that education is still being underfunded on reserves across the nation. There's a shortfall. The shortfall grew. So there's a report that came out in 2016 from the Parliamentary Budget Officer's Office, and they said that the shortfall grew between $336 million and $665 million in 2016 to 2017. And as recent as June of 2018, the Auditor General said that the high school graduation rate between non-Indigenous people and Indigenous kids has actually grown. This is another young hero that the Caring Society looks to as an exemplary person and an exemplary young woman. This is Shannon Kustachin. She's from the Attawapiskat First Nation up in Northern Ontario on the James Bay coast. Their elementary school had been contaminated back in 1979 by diesel that had leaked under their school. And I'm sure some of you may have read the CBC articles about this because it was so highlighted in the news. The government had said, they just left it. Nothing had been done. The community finally stopped going to the school. They said, our kids are getting sick, our teachers are getting sick, this can no longer go on. In 2000, the government said, okay, we'll give you temporary portables. Those temporary portables lasted 14 years. 14 years. In 2014, they finally got their school. Shannon was not around to see that because she had tragically passed in a car accident. Because there was no high school in her community, she had to commute back and forth. During her short time on this planet, she made so much of a difference. She taught us at the Caring Society that it's easy to engage people. It's easy to engage people through YouTube when you put a call out, like her and her classmates did, because they fought for that new school. In grade 8, a lot of kids are going on trips. I remember mine. I was in Quebec City with my classmates. I was in French immersion, so we did that. And her and her classmates said, you know what? They were supposed to go to Niagara Falls, and they said, no, we're going to take that money to send 3 of our representatives, including Shannon, to Ottawa to speak to the then Superintendent of Indigenous Affairs or Minister of Indigenous Affairs. And she said, I wish my school was as nice as your office. Because he asked her, he said, what do you think of my office? And that's what she said to him. And he told her, there's no money for your school. We don't have money to fund this school. And she said, well, I'm not going to give up. And she never did. She never gave up trying. And that was one of the things that she did in her short life. She led us to create Shannon's Dream, with the help of her family, of course. And Shannon's Dream is really about safe and comfy schools, because Shannon knew that it was not just her community that needed schooling. It was schools across the country that are going through this. Nationally, First Nations students receive $2,000 to $3,000 less per student. That's huge when you think about extracurricular activities, special aid, all these kinds of things. So that's really what Shannon was all about, was making sure that all kids had the same opportunities to have an education. The Caring Society really believes that the government needs to take a good look. Take a good look at why these ideologies are still happening. They're still fueled by this colonial ideology and practice that continues to affect services to First Nations kids. The Spirit Bear Plan is really about calling on the Parliamentary Budget Officer to cost out all shortfalls to First Nations kids. It's about the government consulting with First Nations to create community-based plans and to end all inequities. It's about the government complying with all those tribunal rulings. It's about the government departments that give services to First Nations kids to identify and end those discriminatory practices. And it's also about training, making sure that services are delivered in a way that works for First Nations communities. So these issues, they seem really high level. But I really like to say that being a change maker for First Nations kids, it's not complicated at all. How many people here have young children or no young children or maybe grandchildren? Raise your hands. A lot of people. How many people have heard those little ones say, it's not fair? Anybody? Yeah, a few hands, but I feel like my little guy's getting there pretty soon. He already tells me non-verbally, and I just say, you know what? Oh, anyways, good times ahead with my toddler. But we all can relate to that. It's not fair, and it's not fair. Children understand the principles of fairness and equality. So when people say it's complicated, I say, well, we work with children and young people across the country, and they know it's not fair. They don't make it complicated. They just want to see this change happen. And I think what's important is to remember that incremental equality, piecemeal approaches, they don't work. Children don't have incremental childhoods. This is something really important. We need to make sure that children are valued in the way that all children, First Nations children, are valued like all other kids in the country. And really being an ally to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. And I always say to people, if you're unsure, ask. A lot of what I like to talk about is moral courage. So moral courage, it's not a concept we came up with. It's something, you can Google it and you'll find a whole YouTube channel about moral courage. Moral courage is really about standing up for something that might not be the most popular thing. The Caring Society, when we filed the complaint in 2007, things were fine. We actually had previously government grants to do the work that we're doing. Eventually, we lost that funding. We no longer received government department funding. And for a little while, our little organization that could, we were really frightened that we would lose jobs. At the time, I didn't have a child, so there wasn't as much at stake for me. One of my colleagues had 4 children. And we took the decision. Cindy asked us, she said, are you okay with this? And we said yes, because this is for children. And I think moral courage really invites people to make those courageous steps, even if it's not something as large as filing a human rights complaint. But we see it happen in small moments in all of our lives, standing up for what's right, standing up for what's just, and standing up for First Nations kids and vulnerable people who don't maybe have as much of a voice. So the Caring Society knows that it's really daunting to try and figure out, how do I start? How do I do this? We ended up creating 7 free ways that people can make a difference. It takes 2 minutes to sign up. It's completely free. And it's supporting things like Shannon's Dream, Jordan's Principle, and signing up to be a witness to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, because we know that that case isn't complete. And we want people to decide for themselves whether or not they think the government is treating First Nations kids fairly. We started this new, sort of area called Reconciling History. Reconciling History is really about learning about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, its calls to action, and ways that we can work toward that. We are actually going to be creating an interactive walking tour around Ottawa. So it's self-guided. There's actually already some plaques that have been put in Beechwood Cemetery. So that's Peter Henderson Bryce's grave. He now has a plaque there. So if anyone's ever in Ottawa, if you come to Beechwood Cemetery, you can visit the grave of Peter Henderson Bryce, Duncan Campbell Scott, and another figure in the residential school's history was Nicholas Flood Davin. So that's what Reconciling History is all about, is just taking that opportunity to learn and to take some action. Does anybody know who this is? This bear? It's Spirit Bear. So Spirit Bear is so sacred to us. He represents all of the 165,000 children and young people who were affected by the child welfare complaint. He's really our symbol of reconciliation, a symbol of hope, a symbol of love, and he's seen all of and witnessed all of our hearings at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. He's actually got more education than probably in this entire room. He's been honored with doctorates. He recently got his PhD. And he co-authored 2 books with Cindy. And so one is called Spirit Bear and Children Make History, which is aimed for grades 3 to 6. And it's really a book about the tribunal. But I say it's for any age. And there's also learning guides to go along with it. This past fall, he published another book, Spirit Bear Fishing for Knowledge, Catching Dreams, which is a beautiful, beautiful book about Shannon's Dream, honoring that, and teaching a little bit about residential schools as well, and the importance of traditional knowledge. One of our most exciting initiatives at the Caring Society is the Barrister program. So if anyone ever comes to our office is a deluge of bears and stuffed animals. It's completely not what you'd think for our organization. And so what we do is if people are interested in having an barrister, we just ask that we can send you one, and theoretically, we would hope that people would send us a bear back so we can keep our program going. And the idea is to have your bear guide you through reconciliation activities. We also created a calendar, Spirit Bear's Guide to Reconciliation, which has an activity for each month that people can engage in. And it's really easy. And so barristers can be named if you want to work with an elder in your community or a traditional knowledge keeper to help you name your bear. Spirit Bear has the largest wardrobe. He's famous. He really is famous, I'm telling you. But he has a whole wardrobe of clothes that people across the country have made him. So we encourage people to get an outfit made, maybe some, jewelry or whatever made for your bear. I'd invite you all to celebrate with us on May 10th. We'll be having Bear Witness Day celebrations across the country. Bear Witness Day is really about learning about Jordan's Principle, fighting for First Nations kids and others to have the services they need in the country, and celebrating in loving ways. Having a teddy bear tea party, having a bake sale, having time on your coffee break. But most importantly, bringing your bear to your office, to your school, to wherever it is. And you're not too old. Don't think you are. Another activity, we try to have activities throughout the year and events throughout the year so people can participate in reconciliation at any time. This is called Honoring Memories, Planting Dreams. And this is about planting heart gardens in honor of survivors of residential schools and those who passed away and honoring their memory. Heart gardens have been planted in a lot of different ways across the country. You can work with elders or knowledge keepers to find out what the traditional medicines are and to see if that's okay to plant. We've seen them on walls in schools. There's just a lot of ways that people can get creative. And each heart is meant to represent that person, or it's meant to represent your commitment to reconciliation. And one of our newest events that we hold is School is a Time for Dreams. It's mostly about learning about Shannon's dream and posting to social media, doing all those kinds of things to honor that all kids have dreams. So we ask young people to post what they want to be when they grow up, because we all have dreams. And we know Shannon's dream was to be a lawyer, and other First Nations kids across the country. These young people, one of my favorite ones here in this picture is, I want to be a princess. Like, come on, how many of us wanted to be that when we were younger? So, it's really about just uplifting those dreams of First Nations young people. So I just want to conclude by thank you all for being heroes in what you're doing in your daily work. And if you take nothing else from this presentation, I just hope that you'll consider continuing to be a change maker and knowing that the difference can happen in small ways. It doesn't have to be huge, it doesn't have to be monumental. It can be small things that create big change. So I hope that you will consider taking action and visiting us on our Caring Society webpage, and hoping that you'll consider making a difference for First Nations kids or continue to make a difference. So thank you so very much, everybody. I appreciate your time today. Any questions? Yeah.
I think we have a few minutes for questions. That's okay. Does anyone have any questions for Andrea? Do we have a mic anywhere at all?
How does this come out? I'm actually going to go reporter style. So if anyone has a question, I'm going to come to you. I have to, yeah. Where should I go first? Here? There? Okay. Where am I going? Oh, hi. I'm just going to ask you to speak into the mic.
I was just curious if any of these slides you have on YouTube or Facebook, because we could all share, because honestly, I've never seen any of this, and it would be awesome to be able to share this and put it more publicly known. I have heard of Jordan's, that one, but I've never heard of any of the others.
Thank you for that. I could certainly share my my slides. I'll send on. They can forward them, and you're welcome to look on our website because all of this information is maybe not some of the contact stuff, but a lot of it's on our website as well. So. Mm-hmm.
We're also video recording, and so the videos of the sessions will be made available. Sorry, we're also doing video recording today, and so the sessions will be made available on the Choose Well website as well as the Healthy Communities Hub afterwards.
Okay, I'm coming back over. I like this. I'm never engaged like this, so.
Okay, so kind of like on the same lines as this lady over there. Oh yeah, kind of like on the same lines as this lady over there. So First Nations students receive annually $2,000 to $3,000 less than non-First Nations students. Where can we access the information that you got this based off of? Because it's me being a First Nations student, this entire table and like the other First Nations that are around here, I guarantee you it hit it where it count. This hit, hits at home, right? And so I kind of want to know this knowledge, and so I can kind of pass it on because I guarantee none of the students on my reservation or other reservations know this knowledge, because like it actually, when you go off reservation to other schools, you can actually notice that we do receive and less, and now I actually know, and just that I'm thanking you for that, for giving me that knowledge, It's kind of like, it really hits me, it's getting me like kind of like emotional because like that was very important. If you guys wanted to understand that, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'd be happy to send along information to you or to the organizers to send to everyone because I do think it's very important, and yeah, it's exactly why we do this work. So I really thank you for sharing that with me. It makes me teary as well, so thank you. Okay. That's okay. I have to get my steps in somehow. I've been, driving the car. Edmonton is so big, by the way. Just like driving for like half an hour to get downtown. Oh my goodness.
So I have to admit my ignorance. I was pretty unfamiliar with Jordan's principle, and I've learned a lot just being right here. So I guess my question is, if that's now become law, who is the body that decides if these needs are being met or what needs there are in the first place? Like, is this just a send in a suggestion kind of situation, and then the government might send somebody out to look, or how does it get from a need to problem solved in this line?
So to be clear, it's not law yet. It's a legal rule. So it's a legal rule under the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal are the ones who are able to give those non-compliance orders. I'm not quite sure what our next steps are going to be. We could, I guess, take legal action if the government of Canada doesn't implement Jordan's principle. But we're hoping that the tribunal will at least keep jurisdiction over it for another year because there's no really oversight body. The Caring Society is currently the organization that we're helping community members or individuals who are having troubles with Jordan's principle. But of course, our organization is very modest. We're 8 people, so our capacity is really limited. So we're really pushing that there are things in place before the tribunal doesn't have jurisdiction over this, so that Jordan's principle will continue in its spirit. Thanks for that question. Anyone else? Oh, making me work today.
Just to share some information and how we have accessed the Jordan's Principle funding for programs that we do in the community of Marley. So about a year and months ago, I attended a conference on Jordan's Principle that was held over, I think, at the Elbows a hotel in Calgary. Can't remember the name. And so with the support of a director, we were able to bring in a full allied team. So I work at a health center, and prior to that, prior to the allied team coming on, there were just primary care, so doctors and nurses. Now we have a full health allied team that consists of 2 social workers, a dietitian, a physiotherapist, and a occupational staff. We've also been instrumental in bringing in quite a bit of funding for programs for the youth. So I do a lot of the proposal writing. So we have programs in place for working with youth 12 to 18. We have an after-school program that runs in Marley, Eden Valley, and it's also running in Sutina. So I know Sutina got some money as well. So one of the things that I just were able to bring to get funding for was transportation for the youth programs. So the argument was, well, if you're going to give us the funding for programs, we need to get the youth here, and transportation is always a barrier. And they supported the purchase of 2 15-seat youth, like buses, so we could get youth through the programs. We have a full team that works with special need kids. So the Renfrew has an education department that works with special needs. The health center were able to contract a whole team of specialists to come out, and we have programs right in the community that works with special needs. And there are many more things that we're working towards.
Was there someone else's hand up at this table? Okay. Does anyone else have a question? Does it spin around? Okay, well, I'm going to head up to the front.
All right. We are about, healthy, active living, so we had to make you get your steps in, right? So Andrea, on behalf of Communities Choose Well and the Alberta Cancer Prevention Legacy Fund, we would just like to thank you very much for this very inspiring presentation and just sharing your story about being a change maker as an organization, filled with very passionate people who are committed to the cause. And I think also what resonated with me as well is just that notion that it takes those acts of courage. And I actually think it's very fitting that at the Indigenous gathering this morning, my rock is about courage. And so I think that was really what it comes down to, is just finding those moments in your day-to-day life when you can have the courage to do something that will make a difference, whether it's just something very small, like speaking up for something that you believe in, or a larger act of courage. So thank you very much for that wonderful presentation and your time here with us today. Thank you.